Part 1. My sister didn't start screaming until she realized exactly how wealthy my husband's family was. 1 minute, Chloe was standing beside the dance floor with a champagne glass in her hand. The next, she was staring at Daniel, as if someone had just told her she had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. "I should have married him," she said. For half a second, I thought she was making one of those jokes that only counted as jokes because everyone else was expected to pretend they were funny. Then she grabbed the train of my wedding dress. That money, that house, that man, those should have been mine. I reached for her wrist. My mother caught my left arm. My father closed his hand around my right. "Stop fighting her, Ellie," Dad snapped. Then the sound of tearing fabric cut through my wedding reception. Daniel moved before I could. He stepped between us, removed Dad's hand from my arm, then looked directly at Mum. "Let her go." For once, I didn't apologize. I didn't calm Chloe down. I didn't explain why everybody needed to be reasonable. I looked at my parents and said, "We're leaving." At the time, I thought my sister had destroyed my wedding dress because she wanted my husband's life. 5 days later, I opened an architecture award submission and found something else of mine sitting underneath Chloe's name. And unlike the dress, that theft had started long before my wedding. The moment before everything went wrong had been so ordinary that I remembered it more clearly than the shouting. A photographer was trying to organize Daniel and me beneath a row of warm pendant lights near the old stone fireplace. Someone behind us dropped a fork. Glasses touched. A jazz version of a song I'd forgotten the name of floated through the room. My wedding dress had a narrow lace panel running down the back and a soft train that spread across the floor without looking theatrical. That was why I had chosen it. The dressmaker had laughed when I spent 10 minutes asking how the internal seams carried the weight. "You're the first bride who's ever inspected the structure before the embroidery," she'd said. Occupational hazard. At 38, I had spent enough years working with historic buildings to know that the most important parts of a structure were often the ones nobody noticed. Daniel had liked that answer when I told him. "Sounds familiar," he'd said. I'd elbowed him for it. Now, standing in the reception room, I could see Chloe several feet away speaking to one of Daniel's cousins. She had been drinking, but she wasn't stumbling. Her back was straight. Her smile was fixed. Then the cousin gestured toward Daniel's father and mentioned something about one of the Ashcroft hotels reopening after restoration. Chloe's eyes shifted. That was all. Just a small movement. I knew my sister well enough to notice it. 6 years earlier, before Daniel and I knew each other, Chloe had gone on 2 dates with him through mutual friends. She had told me afterward that he was nice but boring, and apparently too content with his job to be ambitious. Daniel had never mentioned it until we'd been dating for months. Neither of us had considered 2 dinners 6 years earlier important enough to build our lives around. Chloe apparently had. She crossed the room toward us. "Daniel," she said brightly, "you never told me your family owned hotels." Daniel's mouth tightened slightly. "We haven't spoken in years, Chloe." "Oh, come on. You know what I mean." The photographer lowered her camera. A few people nearby had started paying attention. I stepped toward Chloe. "This isn't the time." She looked at me instead. There was something almost incredulous in her expression. "Did you know?" "Know what?" "All this." Her hand made a loose circle that seemed to include the room. The guests, Daniel, perhaps the entire building. I glanced at Daniel. His parents had money. Considerable money, by my standards. They owned a small group of boutique hotels and several older properties that had been converted or restored over the years. But Daniel didn't run the family business, and money had never been the center of our relationship. That answer would have been useless to Chloe. "You should probably get some air," I told her. She laughed. Then she said, "I should have married him." A few people went quiet. My skin prickled beneath the sleeves of my dress. "Chloe." "What?" she demanded. "I had him first." Daniel answered before I could. "We had 2 dinners." She ignored him. "That house his parents have. The hotels. These people." Her voice rose. "Do you even understand what you married into?" My first instinct was still the old one. Contain it. Move her somewhere private. Keep Mum from panicking. Keep Dad from getting angry. Make sure nobody remembered the Price family as the people who ruined their eldest daughter's wedding. So I stepped closer and lowered my voice. "Come outside with me." Chloe looked at my hand as though I'd insulted her. Then she grabbed my train. That wedding was supposed to be mine. The first pull only tightened the fabric around my hips. The second tore something behind me. I twisted around instinctively and caught her wrist. That was when Mum seized my arm. "Ellie, stop." Dad caught the other. "Stop fighting her." For one stunned second, I stared at him. Not at Chloe. At him. I had spent most of my life translating that sentence into nicer language. Be the older one. Be the sensible one. She's upset. You know how she gets. Don't make things worse. Then the lace tore. Daniel stepped forward so fast his chair went backward against the floor. He removed Dad's hand from my arm. Not violently, not theatrically, just firmly enough that Dad had to let go. Let her go. Mum's fingers loosened next. The venue coordinator was already coming toward us with 2 members of staff. Chloe still had a strip of lace in her hand. For once, nobody looked at me and waited for me to fix her. My hands were shaking. I made them stop by pressing my palms against the sides of my dress. "We're leaving," I said. Daniel looked at me. Okay. That one word almost undid me more than the shouting had. New argument. No instruction. No deciding what would be best for me. Just okay. The venue staff took Chloe toward the corridor, while Mum hurried after them. Dad stayed where he was. "You don't need to make this bigger than it is," he said. I looked at the torn fabric pooling behind me. That was the first time that evening I almost laughed. Instead, I walked away. The venue coordinator found us in a small dressing room 10 minutes later. I had changed into the simple cream dress I'd planned to wear the following morning. My wedding gown lay across a chair, the torn train hanging nearly to the floor. "I've made an incident note," the coordinator said carefully. "We also have the names of the staff who were present. If you'd like us to contact the police, we can." Daniel didn't answer for me. He stood beside the door, one hand resting against the frame, waiting. The room smelled faintly of hairspray and flowers. I stared at the rip. The damage looked worse when everything around it was quiet. "No," I said. "Not tonight. Please keep the incident record and the staff details." "Of course. I may ask for them later." She nodded. When she left, Daniel crouched beside the chair. "What do you need from me?" There were 100 possible answers. Call your parents. Call somebody. Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me this isn't what my family is. Instead I said, "Don't call your parents." He waited. "Don't make this the Ashcrofts against the Prices. I don't want anybody fixing this for me. All right, just get me out of here." He stood. "That I can do." We left our own wedding reception before the cake had been served. I carried the garment bag myself. Through the clear plastic, the torn lace kept catching the light. The next morning, Mum called before 9. I watched her name light up on my phone until the ringing nearly stopped. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee. "You don't have to answer," he said. "I know. That was precisely why I did." "Hello?" Mum exhaled as though I had been the difficult one for taking so long. I hardly slept. Neither had I. I said nothing. "Chloe is devastated." My fingers tightened around the phone. "About what?" "Ellie." "No. Tell me. What is she devastated about?" Mum went quiet for 2 seconds. That things got so out of hand. Not that she had torn my dress. Not that she had screamed for my husband. Not that Mum and Dad had physically restrained me while Chloe did it. Things had somehow gotten out of hand all by themselves. "She humiliated herself," Mum continued, "in front of Daniel's family. Do you have any idea how she feels this morning?" I looked across the bedroom at the garment bag hanging from the wardrobe door. "Probably not." "Don't be sarcastic." "I'm not." Mum Sehil. That sigh had been part of my childhood soundtrack. You know how Chloe gets when she feels rejected. There it was. The little bridge I was supposed to cross. From what Chloe had done to why I needed to understand it. "Your father thinks you should send her something simple," Mum said. "Nothing dramatic. Just tell her you know yesterday got out of hand and you still love her." My thumb moved automatically toward the messaging icon. I could already hear the version of myself who had done this 100 times. "I'm sorry things got messy. I didn't mean to upset you. I know you didn't really mean it." The words were almost fully formed before I stopped. Behind the plastic garment bag, the tear cut diagonally through the lace. I'm not apologizing to Chloe. I didn't say apologize. You gave me the exact words. I'm trying to save your relationship with your sister. No. You're asking me to make it easier for her not to deal with what she did. Mum's voice changed. Not louder. Flatter. Then don't be surprised when this gets worse. The call ended 2 minutes later. Dad sent one text shortly afterward. Keep Daniel's family out of this. We handle our own problems. I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down. For the rest of that day, I did something that felt far more radical than it should have. Nothing. I didn't call Chloe. I didn't call Dad. I didn't write a long explanation to Mum. Daniel and I ate leftover wedding food sent over by the venue. We walked for almost an hour. That night, for the first time I could remember after a family crisis, I went to bed without having repaired anyone's mood. By Monday, work felt almost comforting. I was an associate conservation architect at a practice in Bristol, which meant a large portion of my life was spent asking buildings questions nobody else wanted to ask. What changed? When? Who approved it? What was original? What had somebody quietly altered and then forgotten to record? That morning, a junior architect brought me a drawing set marked Final. I opened the issue history first. There's a missing revision, I said. He leaned over my desk. Where? Here. C goes to E. He looked embarrassed. I thought the file name. Never trust a file because somebody called it Final. He laughed. I did too. It was such a normal sentence that I didn't notice its irony until much later. Around noon, one of the partners stopped by my desk. Still interested in taking lead on the civic restoration package? I looked at my calendar. There was space. Real space. But years of family habit made me hesitate anyway. Chloe always had a crisis before deadlines. Mum always found a reason I should come to Bath. Dad always said he only needed an hour. I'll confirm by the end of the week, I said. Fair enough. After he left, I opened my email to check a project thread. A search suggestion pulled up another name. Chloe Price. Dozens of old messages sat beneath it. Most had some variation of the same subject. Quick look? Tiny question. 5 minutes, promise. My mouse stopped. 3 years earlier, she had sent me a PDF on a Friday night because a listed building consultant had objected to part of a circulation plan. I had opened it on my personal laptop at the kitchen table. Not my office computer. Not my employer's software or storage. My machine. My time. My own PDF tools. 5 minutes became nearly 4 hours. By Monday, the revised package had gone out. A week later, Chloe posted a photograph standing beside the client. Another problem solved. At the time, I had smiled. The building was safe. That was what mattered. Another memory arrived with the next email. Mum leaning over a printed capability sheet while I stood beside the Price Studio printer. Don't put your name all over it, Ellie. It confuses clients. I only put it next to the conservation note. They don't need to understand every little distinction. So I removed it. Another email. Dad at Sunday lunch. Family doesn't keep score. I had laughed. Good, because I don't have time to invoice you. The joke felt different now. My phone buzzed. A message from Aisha Rahman. We had worked together on several heritage projects over the years, including a few where Price Studio had been involved on interiors. Congratulations to Chloe. Didn't know Harrogate was being entered. Beneath it was a link. West Country Heritage and Design Awards. I clicked. A shortlist brochure opened. Harrogate House. Price Studio Limited. Creative and Project Lead. Chloe Price. I almost closed it. Chloe had worked on Harrogate. There was nothing strange about her being listed. Then I reached the third image. A technical drawing occupied the lower half of the page. Most people would have seen lines. Dimensions. Notes. I saw a decision. A retained section of historic fabric had been marked in exactly the way I used when I wanted the next person reading the drawing to understand that removal was not an option. The note beside it had an awkward break in the wording. I knew why. I had written it at 1:14 on a Sunday morning after Chloe sent me a file with the words, 5 minutes, promise. My hand went still on the mouse. I downloaded the brochure. Then I opened my old personal archive. The wedding dress had been torn in front of a room full of people. This was quieter. Someone had torn my name away and left the work standing. The first thing I did was make myself prove it. Not prove that Chloe was selfish. Not prove that my parents had favored her. Those were emotional conclusions, and emotion was exactly what they would use against me if I went to them too soon. I needed something smaller. Something boring. Dates. Files. Versiones. By lunchtime, my dining table looked less like part of a newlywed apartment and more like the temporary desk I used whenever a restoration project became complicated. My personal laptop sat in the middle, charger stretched toward the wall. Beside it were a notebook, 2 pencils, and a mug of coffee I had reheated twice without drinking. The Harrogate Award brochure remained open on the screen. I zoomed into the drawing again. Same retained wall notation. Same shortened wording. Same little break between 2 phrases where I had deleted a sentence and rewritten it at 1:14 on a Sunday morning. Memory could flatter itself. Files did not. So I opened the folder where I kept personal correspondence. For years, every time Chloe sent something to my private email, I had saved the attachments under the project name because that was simply how my brain worked. I hated orphan files. A document without a date, context, or version history made me itch. My family called it obsessive. At work, people called it good practice. I started a spreadsheet. Date. Request received. File received. What I changed. What I returned. What appeared later in the issued package, if I could establish it. One more column went in after a moment. Tool used. That mattered for a reason I had never expected to matter. Every one of those late-night favors had been done on my own equipment, my laptop, my personal email, my own PDF software, and subscriptions. If I had needed to sketch something, I had done it by hand at my kitchen table and scanned it myself. Nothing came from my Bristol practice. No office workstation, no company cloud folder, no employer template, no paid work hours. That distinction had always been automatic. Mixing one practice's resources with another company's project would have bothered me long before I understood how much the prices were taking for granted. The first Harrogate email I found was almost 4 years old. Subject: Tiny favor. Chloe had written, "Can you tell me if this looks ridiculous? 5 minutes max." Attached was an early ground floor plan. I opened my reply. The rear circulation creates a problem because you're cutting through surviving historic fabric for something you can solve elsewhere. I've marked an alternative. My attachment was still there. So was the timestamp. 11:48 on a Thursday night. I added it to the spreadsheet. Another message appeared 6 weeks later. "Can you fix the circulation issue before Dad sees it? He's already stressed about the client." That one made my fingers stop over the keyboard. Not because I had forgotten it. Because I remembered exactly what happened afterward. Chloe had called the next afternoon, pleased. "Worked perfectly," she had said. "Client loved it. I had been happy for her." That was the part I hated admitting. Nobody had stolen anything from me in a dark room while I fought to keep it. I had handed over the first pieces myself. Again and again. By late afternoon, there were 9 Harrogate entries in my spreadsheet. 3 were quick comments. 2 were genuine 5-minute answers. 4 were not. One had taken most of a Saturday. Another had involved rewriting a technical note after a consultant queried whether Price Studios' proposed intervention was too destructive. The award brochure described the final response as part of Chloe's sensitive reworking of circulation and historic fabric. I read that line 3 times. Then I leaned back. Daniel had come home without my noticing. He stood at the edge of the room, jacket still on. That face usually means a building has lied to you. Buildings don't lie. People drawing them? That happens. He set his keys down. "Have you eaten?" I glanced toward the kitchen. Apparently that answered him. Daniel didn't ask to see the files. He didn't come around the table and start reading over my shoulder. He only said, "Do you need to stop?" "No." "Do you need food?" "Yes." He nodded toward the laptop. "And what are you trying to establish?" The answer came slower than I expected. Whether I'm angry because of the wedding, or whether the record is actually wrong. Daniel looked at the spreadsheet. "Can both be true?" I stared at the screen. Yes. That was worse. Because anger could be dismissed. A pattern was harder. By the time we ate, the pattern had 12 dates. And one sentence from an old email sat at the bottom of my screen like a splinter I could no longer pretend not to feel. Can you fix the circulation issue before Dad sees it? The next morning, I called Aisha. Not because I wanted a witness. Because I wanted someone outside my head who had actually been on Harrogate. She answered from what sounded like a train platform. If this is about the award link, I swear I wasn't trying to stir anything. It is about the link. There was a pause. All right. Do you still have your project correspondence from Harrogate? Some of it. Why? Before I tell you what I think, can I ask you something specific? That sounds ominously like you. Despite myself, I smiled. Did you ever understand me to be formally appointed by Price Studio on that project? No. The answer came quickly enough that my stomach tightened. Then she added. But I assumed you were consulting for them informally. Why? Because technical responses kept coming back that sounded like you. My pencil stopped. What do you mean, sounded like me? You have a very particular way of explaining why something can't just be ripped out because a client finds it inconvenient. That is not particular. It is extremely particular. A train announcement blurred behind her. Aisha lowered her voice when she came back. I've got at least a few emails. Consultant queries came through Price Studio. Then revised notes came back. Some of them had your phrasing in them. Could you send me only what you already hold in your own correspondence? Yes. Don't contact anyone else. I wasn't going to. And don't say anything about what you think happened. This time, her pause was longer. Ellie, I don't know what happened. Relief moved through me so sharply it almost hurt. Good. What I know, she continued, is that I thought you were involved more formally than you apparently were. That's enough. Her email arrived half an hour later. 3 consultant queries. One had gone to Price Studio. Chloe had forwarded it to me with, "Can you translate this into normal human language?" My reply had explained the issue and suggested 2 ways to resolve it. 3 days later, Aisha received an updated issue sheet from Price Studio. The wording was polished. The structure was almost exactly mine. No name. No note that the conservation input had come from outside the studio. I added the chain to the chronology. Aisha called again before I finished. One more thing. What? I remember a tender team sheet. Different project phase, maybe. It mentioned conservation support. My pulse changed. Was my name on it? I honestly don't remember. Do you have it? Maybe. I'll check. But don't build anything on my memory. I won't. After we hung up, I stared at my spreadsheet. That was the first moment I stopped asking whether Chloe had used one of my drawings. The question was larger now. What had Price Studio been telling people I was? By evening, I had an answer. Not a complete one. Enough to make me sit very still. An old email from Dad contained a capability statement attached as a PDF. The earliest version listed. Conservation input, Eleanor Price. My full name. Accurate enough. I found another copy from several months later. Same studio. Same general wording. Same paragraph describing heritage capability. My name was gone. In its place. Our in-house conservation expertise allows us to integrate sensitive historic fabric decisions from concept through delivery. In-house. I read it once. Then again. Dad's name sat on the cover email. For several minutes, anger gave me a very clean answer. Dad. He handled contracts. He sent final packages. He worried constantly about what clients thought Price Studio could deliver. Maybe Chloe had been taking the applause while he built the machinery behind it. Then I opened the message history. The wording had been circulated between Dad and Mum before it went out. One of Mum's replies was still there. Keep the team description simple. Chloe is the face of this one. Too many names make a small studio look disorganized. My first explanation cracked. Dad had sent it. Mum had shaped it. Chloe had benefited. And I had approved none of that specific wording. The ugly possibility was not that one person had plotted against me. It was that nobody needed to. The system worked because each of them did the convenient part. Dad sent. Mum simplified. Chloe stood in front. And whenever the technical floor began to give way, somebody called me. By Friday, I had enough questions to stop hiding behind my laptop. I emailed all 3 of them. I'd like to meet about Harrogate and the award submission. Somewhere neutral. Sunday afternoon. Mum called within 4 minutes. I let it ring. A text followed. Why are you making this so formal? I replied by email. Sunday at 2 works for me. That was my second boundary. The first had been refusing to apologize. This one felt stranger. No more family arguments disappearing into phone calls nobody could later remember the same way. Sunday, I chose a cafe in Bath, where none of us had history. No childhood kitchen. No Price Studio meeting room. No chair Mum could point to and tell me where to sit. Chloe arrived last. She dropped her handbag onto the empty chair beside her instead of greeting me. Mum watched me over the rim of her teacup. Dad looked tired. I placed a printed copy of the award contributor page on the table. Not the whole evidence file. Just the page. What role did you submit for me? Chloe gave a small laugh. You're serious? Yes. You checked things. What role did you submit? Mum leaned forward. Ellie, you're turning a few favors into something much more dramatic than it was. I looked at her. I'm asking what was written down. Dad rubbed a thumb against the edge of his cup. The studio submitted the project. I know. Then I don't understand what you're asking. Was my work included? A server passed behind me carrying a tray of glasses. I heard every one of them tremble lightly against the others. Nobody answered. That was an answer, but not one I could use. So I asked again. Were drawings or technical notes I produced included in the award material? Chloe exhaled hard. You make it sound like I stole your sketchbook. I haven't said you stole anything. That's exactly what you're implying. No. I'm asking what was submitted. Mum reached toward the paper. Those drawings belong to the Harrogate project. Yes. You worked on them for the studio. I worked on them for you because you asked me privately. You helped your sister. That's not a professional category. Dad finally looked directly at me. Family doesn't keep score. There it was. Same sentence. Same calm tone. For years, it had ended discussions. This time, something in me refused to move out of its way. An award submission does. Chloe pushed her chair back slightly. Oh, please. I'm not asking for an award. Then what is this about? My name, my qualifications, my work. Mum's mouth tightened. You have a career, Ellie. A very good one. Chloe has been building this studio with us. The old argument arrived, dressed as fairness. You have enough. She needs more. Therefore, anything of yours that helps her is surplus. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'm going to make this very simple. Dad frowned. Don't talk to us like clients. I'm talking about professional work. I slid the paper back toward myself. From today onward, Price Studio does not use my name, qualifications, drawings, notes, technical comments, or conservation input in any submission, proposal, award entry, marketing material, or project document without asking me in writing. Chloe stared at me. Mum said my name in warning. I continued. If you want me formally involved in something, ask. I can say yes or no. If I say yes, the role and credit are agreed in writing. Dad's face changed, though I could not tell whether it was anger or disbelief. You're drawing contracts between sisters now? No. I'm drawing a boundary around my work. Mum sat back. Then stop pretending Price Studio is your family business. Something moved low in my chest. Once. That sentence would have made me rush to reassure her. I would have said, of course it was still ours. Of course I loved them. Of course I wasn't trying to make trouble. Instead, I folded the award page. All right. For once, Mum looked as though she had expected an argument and did not know what to do with agreement. I left first. The email confirming the boundary went out from my phone before I reached the train station. Daniel was cooking when I got home. He waited until I had taken off my coat. My mum asked me something. I stopped. What? She remembered Price Studio once approached someone she knows about interior work at one of the smaller properties. She asked whether she should tell them not to use the studio. My stomach tightened. No. I thought you'd say that. Then why ask? Because you get to decide. I leaned against the counter. I don't want your family punishing mine for me. They wouldn't be punishing them for you. It would still turn this into whose family has more influence. Daniel nodded. So I tell Mum to stay out of it. Yes, that's what I'll do. A pot simmered behind him. For the next hour, we ate dinner and talked about anything except Chloe. At first, it felt irresponsible. Then it felt like oxygen. Monday morning, the civic restoration file was waiting on my desk. I opened my calendar and blocked the site visit for the following weekend before anyone from Bath could claim the space. Then my inbox refreshed. An unfamiliar sender appeared. West Country Heritage and Design Awards Contributor Clarification, Harrogate House. I opened it. The message was routine in tone. That made my pulse beat harder. Supporting materials in the entry identified me as having contributed to technical conservation work. Before the project could proceed to final judging, the administrator needed contributors to confirm their roles and consent to the use of identified material. The current description read, Chloe Price Creative and Project Lead. Eleanor Price Technical Support. I stared at those 2 words. Technical support. 9 Harrogate entries in my chronology. 4 substantial interventions. 3 consultant query chains. A circulation solution. A retained fabric note. All flattened into 2 words that made it sound as if I had checked spelling. At the bottom was a deadline. 12 days. My phone lit up almost immediately. Chloe. Just sign it, Elle. For once, don't make everything about credit. A week earlier, I might have called her. I might have tried to explain the difference between wanting praise and wanting accuracy. Instead, I saved the award email into my chronology. Then I created a new folder. Harrogate Attribution. For 7 years, my family had treated access to me as permanent. The first boundary they respected was a deadline written by someone outside the family. The folder sat on my desktop for 2 days before I opened it again. Harrogate Attribution. Not evidence. Not theft. Not Chloe. Attribution. That word kept me from turning the entire thing into an argument about who had hurt whom. Wednesday evening, I spread the Harrogate record across my dining table and gave myself one rule. I was not allowed to claim anything I could not prove. That meant some things had to come off my list. There were design conversations I remembered having with Chloe that I could not document. A suggestion about a fireplace surround had been mine, but I had no message, sketch, or marked-up file connecting me to the final choice. Gone. There was a staircase discussion I could remember almost word for word. No record. Gone. By midnight, my neat chronology had become something more useful. 4 columns. Chloe. Price Studio. Me. External consultants. The distinction mattered. Chloe had done real work. She had led client presentations. The interior concept was hers. Several room layouts were hers. She had chosen materials, developed the visual language, and handled the client with a confidence I had never possessed or particularly wanted. Price Studio had coordinated contractors, suppliers, budgets, and general project delivery. Aisha and other consultants had their own contributions. Then there was my column. Historic fabric retention note. Rear circulation revision. 2 consultant responses. A revised opening detail. A technical note explaining why a proposed intervention would damage surviving material unnecessarily. Seeing my work listed beside everyone else's should have made me feel vindicated. Instead, it made me uncomfortable, because the record was not telling me Chloe had done nothing. It was telling me something much harder to argue with. She had done enough that nobody needed to invent her talent. They had erased me anyway. I opened one of the oldest capability statements. The first version said, Conservation Input, Eleanor Price. There I was. 1 line. No fanfare. No exaggerated title. Accurate. A later version used the same project description but replaced my name with Price Studio's in-house conservation approach. I compared the documents side by side. The language had not changed much. Only the ownership had. Buried in the email chain was Mum's message. Keep the team description simple. Chloe is the face of this one. I read it until the words stopped looking like words. For years, I had told myself my parents simply didn't understand what credit meant in professional work. That explanation had been kinder. It was also becoming impossible to keep. Dad called Thursday morning. Can we talk? About Harrogate. Yes. Then yes. He asked if he could come to Bristol. That surprised me enough that I agreed. He arrived after work, carrying no folders, no laptop, no paperwork, just himself. Daniel was still out, which suited me. Not because I needed privacy from my husband, but because Dad had always behaved differently when there was another man in the room. More formal, more careful. I wanted the version of him that spoke to me when he still believed I was only his daughter. We sat at the dining table. He noticed the files. "You've been busy." "I've been accurate." His mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but it didn't become one. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "Did you know my name was removed from the team description?" Dad looked down at his hands. I knew we simplified it. There was that word again. Simplified. What did simplifying mean? It meant presenting a small studio clearly. "Did you know my technical notes were still being used?" "I knew you were helping." Helping. The safest word in our family. It could mean carrying groceries, driving Mum to an appointment, spending an entire Saturday solving someone else's conservation problem. "You were copied on the emails." I was copied on hundreds of emails. That isn't what I asked. Dad leaned back. "You want me to say I read every attachment?" "No." "What do you want me to say, Ellie?" "The truth." His jaw tightened. "I knew Chloe came to you with technical questions. I knew you answered them. You had your own career. You weren't trying to join Price Studio. That doesn't mean my work became Price Studios." "No one said that." I turned my laptop toward him. The two capability statements sat side by side. One named me. One didn't. Dad stared at them. "You understand why clients prefer one clear lead." "I understand why clients prefer clarity." That's what we were trying to give them. No. Clarity would have been telling them who did what. Dad rubbed his forehead. "Small companies don't write a biography every time somebody contributes. Then don't advertise expertise you don't employ." The sentence landed harder than I intended. He looked at me. I waited. "Eventually," Dad said, "Chloe is good with clients." "Yes." "She's good at what she does." "Yes." "Then why are you talking like we built a fake business around her?" "Because I'm not." He frowned. "I'm saying she didn't need my work to become hers in order to be good." That stopped him. For the first time in the conversation, I saw no immediate reply forming on his face. So I continued. "She can be good at interiors without being the person who solved every conservation issue. Those two things can both be true." Dad looked toward the window. "Mum always worried Chloe would lose confidence." There it was. Not an excuse. Not yet. Just an opening. He told me about a project years earlier, when Chloe had been in her 20s. A senior client had dismissed one of her presentations in front of a room full of people. Chloe had come home devastated. I remembered that part. What I had not remembered was the timing. I had completed my professional exams that same week. Mum had booked dinner for me. Halfway through, Chloe called. The dinner ended early. Back then, I had told everyone I didn't mind. Dad continued. "Your mother decided Chloe needed more encouragement after that." "More encouragement. You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do anymore." "She thought Chloe needed to feel she could do this." "And I didn't?" "You never needed that kind of reassurance. The old compliment. The strong one. The sensible one. The one who could survive being overlooked because she had already proved she was capable." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "You protected her confidence with my invisibility." Dad looked at me. He didn't tell me I was wrong. That hurt more than if he had. After he left, I stood at the sink without turning on the tap. For years, I had pictured him as the person caught between Mum and Chloe. The man who hated conflict. The man who understood more than he said. I had mistaken silence for neutrality. He had not needed to invent the system to benefit from keeping it intact. The next morning, I opened the award administrator's email again. The deadline was 9 days away. At the bottom sat a link to the entry timeline. I clicked because I wanted to know when Price Studio had formally submitted. Then I noticed the draft date. 6 weeks before my wedding. I checked it again. The first internal award file I had in my own email archive was older than the reception by more than a month. A near-final version had circulated 2 weeks before I married Daniel. My fingers went still on the keyboard. Until then, some small, embarrassed part of me had been treating the wedding as the beginning. Chloe saw Daniel's family. Chloe saw money. Chloe lost control. Then perhaps that envy had spilled backward into everything else. Except Harrogate was already in motion. My work had already been gathered into the award entry. My contribution had already been reduced. Before Chloe saw Daniel's parents' house. Before she learned the scale of their hotel business. Before she ripped my dress and screamed that my life should have been hers, the wedding hadn't created anything. It had only removed the polite language. I searched older messages. One from Chloe appeared from more than a year earlier. "You don't need the credit, Elle. You already have the career." I sat back. At the time, I had read it as a compliment. Now it sounded remarkably close to something else. "You already have enough. Therefore, I am allowed to take the part you don't need. Career, credit, attention, a husband, a house, status, different objects. Same rule." That afternoon, Mum arrived with the wedding dress. No warning. I opened the door and saw the garment bag hanging over one arm. "What are you doing here? Can I come in?" I almost said no. Then I looked at the dress. 10 minutes. She stepped inside. Daniel wasn't home. Mum laid the garment bag carefully across the back of the sofa. "I spoke to someone about repairing it." "I didn't ask you to." "I know." She handed me an estimate. The price didn't matter. I placed it on the coffee table. Mum touched the plastic covering the dress. "She says she can make it look almost untouched." Almost. That word stayed with me. Mum sat down. "I know you think I always take Chloe's side. I think you did take Chloe's side. She was wrong at the wedding." It was the closest thing to direct acknowledgement I had heard from her. I waited. She was completely wrong to do what she did. Still, I said nothing. "But I need you to understand something." There it was, the doorway back into the old arrangement. Mum told me about Chloe's early career failure, repeating much of what Dad had already said. I did not tell her Dad had been there the day before. She described Chloe coming home convinced she was the stupid one, the less talented one, the daughter who would never measure up. "You were already doing so well," Mum said. "You had your exams, you had people praising you. Chloe needed something of her own. So you gave her parts of mine." Mum flinched. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" "Isn't it? We encouraged her. You removed my name. We were trying to stop everything becoming a competition." I looked at her. "By deciding in advance which one of us was allowed to win?" Mum's expression tightened. "You always make these things sound so harsh." "I'm describing what happened." She reached for the estimate again. "This is exactly why I came. I don't want to fight." Neither did I. That was the dangerous part. I was tired. Tired of spreadsheets. Tired of emails. Tired of remembering every time I had made myself smaller and called it maturity. Understanding why Mum had done it did not make me want revenge. It made me want rest. But rest bought with another lie was the same arrangement in softer wrapping. 2 days later, they invited me to Price Studio after closing. The contributor form was waiting on the meeting table. So was a printed website mock-up. I saw my name before I sat down. Eleanor Price, Conservation Consultant. For several seconds, I could only stare. Mum noticed. "We've been working on something." Dad cleared his throat. "At the award dinner, I can make sure your contribution is acknowledged properly." Chloe sat across from me with her arms folded. "Fine," she said. "I'll say you helped." The word almost ruined the whole performance. Helped. Mum slid the wedding dress estimate toward me. "We'll pay for that too." Another sheet followed. A proposed caption for photographs from the award evening. For the first time in my life, I could see the version of my family I had always wanted printed out in front of me. My name. My work. My parents acknowledging it. A photograph where nobody needed me to stand aside so Chloe looked more important. Dad tapped the contributor form. "We can put all of this behind us." I read the role beside my name. Technical support. Not conservation design contributor. Not conservation architect. Technical support. The website could call me a consultant after the fact. Dad could thank me publicly. Mum could pay to hide the tear in my dress. But the official record they wanted me to sign still reduced what I had actually done. "What exactly are you asking me to agree to?" I asked. Mum's shoulders lowered slightly, as though the hard part was finally over. "Just confirm the form. And the chronology I've been preparing?" Chloe answered. "Don't send it." Dad said, "There's no reason to confuse the award people with internal family history." "It isn't family history. It's years of emails." "Exactly." Chloe leaned forward. "You finally get your credit. What else do you want?" Dad spoke before I could answer. "You finally get the credit you've been asking for." Something inside me stopped. Not broke. Stopped. Because I had never asked. Not once. I had hinted. Waited. Worked. Hoped. But I had never sat in front of my parents and said, "Please tell people I did this." Yet somehow, they knew. They knew exactly what would make me hesitate. The offer in front of me was not proof they had suddenly understood. It was proof they had understood for years. I closed the form. "I need time." Chloe gave an incredulous laugh. "For what?" "To decide whether I'm willing to certify it." Mum's voice softened. "Ellie, please don't throw away a chance to fix this." I looked at the website mock-up again. For a moment, I wanted it badly enough to frighten myself. I said I need time. I took the contributor form with me. That night, it sat on my kitchen counter, while Daniel cleaned 2 wine glasses. I had told him the offer without telling him what I wanted him to say. That mattered. He picked up the form only after I pushed it toward him. "They're putting your name on the website?" "Yes." "And your dad would acknowledge you at the event?" "Yes." "Do you want that?" My throat tightened. Yes. There was no point pretending otherwise. Daniel set the form down. "Then I understand why this is hard." I waited for advice. He didn't give any. After a while, he asked, "If they weren't your parents, would you certify that description?" I looked down. "Technical support." "No." Daniel nodded once. "Then I won't tell you what to do next." The next morning, instead of opening Harrogate, I drove to the civic restoration site. The weather was gray and damp. The old municipal building smelled of wet stone and dust. For 3 hours, nobody asked me to be a daughter. Nobody asked whether Chloe could cope. Nobody asked me to save anyone's confidence. They asked what I thought the building needed. At the end of the visit, I blocked 2 more dates in my calendar for the project. Not around Bath. Not around Price Studio deadlines. Around my own work. The change was small enough that nobody else would have noticed. I did. When I got home, there was a message from Chloe. "Are you seriously still thinking about this?" Then another. "You can't pull your work now. It's already in the entry." I read it once. Then again. A week earlier, she had told me I had only checked a few things. Now it was my work. Already in the entry. The third message arrived before I replied. "You gave it to the family. That's what helping means." There was no dramatic confession. No admission that she had planned to steal anything. She didn't need to give me one. Her words told me something more useful. She believed access had been consent. She believed because I had helped once, I had surrendered the right to decide how that help was described forever. I saved the messages into the Harrogate folder. Then I opened a new email. The recipient was the award administrator. The subject line read, "Correction to contributor. Attribution. Harrogate House." My chronology was attached. The form sat beside the keyboard. For the first time, the choice was not whether Chloe deserved an award. It was whether I still owned the right to describe my own work truthfully. The email stayed open for 11 minutes before I touched the keyboard again. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because I knew exactly what not to say. I didn't write that Chloe had spent my wedding screaming that my husband should have been hers. I didn't describe Mum holding my arm while my dress tore. I didn't explain 7 years of Sunday night favors or how many times Dad had called my work help once the client was happy. None of that belonged in the email. The award administrator did not need my childhood. She needed facts. So I deleted the paragraph I had started the night before and wrote a shorter one. I identified myself as an associate conservation architect working independently from Price Studio. I stated that my contributions to Harrogate had been informal and completed outside my employment, using my own equipment and personal accounts. Then I listed the material I could verify. The rear circulation revision, the retained fabric note, the consultant responses, the opening detail. Beside each item, I gave a date and the corresponding version I still held. Then came the harder section. What I can confirm. Chloe had led the interior concept and client-facing presentation work. Price Studio had coordinated the project. Other consultants had contributed within their disciplines. I had provided specific conservation design input and technical revisions. My fingers paused over the next line. What I cannot confirm. I could not certify that technical support accurately described the extent of my contribution. I could not confirm any wording that implied the conservation approach had been originated solely by Chloe or existed entirely within Price Studio. And I did not consent to my identified material being presented under an attribution I believed was inaccurate. That was all. No accusation. No demand. No suggestion that anyone be punished. I attached the chronology. Then I read the email once as Ellie the daughter. It felt brutal. I read it again as Ellie, the architect. It felt ordinary. That difference told me what I needed to know. My hand still shook when I clicked send. Not much. Just enough that the cursor jumped after the message disappeared from the screen. For a few seconds, the room seemed unnaturally quiet. Then, the refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. My coffee had gone cold. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no thunderclap announcing that I had finally stopped protecting everyone else from consequences. Just a sent email. And for the first time, a decision my parents disliked existed somewhere they could not talk me into remembering differently. The response came the following afternoon. I was at my desk in Bristol when the award administrator's name appeared in my inbox. I closed the drawing I was reviewing before opening it. Her tone was as measured as mine had been. Thank you for the clarification. Harrogate House would be placed on hold pending clarification of contributor roles and the use of the identified material. Price Studio would have several days to provide corrected wording, remove disputed material from the entry, or withdraw if the contribution questions could not be resolved in time. No one called Chloe dishonest. No one called me wronged. The administrator did not care who had ruined whose wedding. She cared whether the entry accurately described the work being judged. I read the message twice. Then I filed it. 5 minutes later, my phone began vibrating. Mum. Dad. Chloe. Mum again. I let all 4 calls go. An email from Dad arrived first. This could have been handled privately. I stared at the sentence. Privately was where almost everything in my life had disappeared. Private conversations. Private favors. Private compromises. Private credit. I replied only. The contributor form was sent to me directly. I answered it accurately. Chloe's message followed. You've made this look like fraud. My stomach tightened. I typed. I did not use that word. 3 dots appeared. Vanished. Appeared again. You knew what would happen. I looked at the award administrator's email. On hold. Clarification required. No public accusation. No sanction. What had happened was exactly what should happen when a record could not yet be confirmed. I wrote, what happens next depends on what Price Studio submits. She called immediately. Against my better judgment, I answered. What do you want from me? Chloe demanded. My work described accurately. You already said that. Because it hasn't changed. You've made them think the entire project is questionable. I told them which parts I contributed to. You think because you marked up a few drawings, Harrogate belongs to you? No. Then why are you doing this? I breathed in slowly. I'm not asking them to give me the project. Then, what do you want? There it was again. The assumption that every boundary concealed a demand. For my work not to be yours. The line went quiet. Then Mum's voice sounded faintly in the background. I couldn't make out the words. That was enough to remind me where Chloe was. Probably at the studio. Possibly with both of them. I did not know. And I wasn't going to fill in the missing parts with guesses. Chloe came back sharper. You couldn't stand letting me have one thing. That's not what this is. It's exactly what this is. No. You can keep every part you actually did. She laughed once. You hear yourself? Yes. Mum took the phone from her. This has gone far enough. Has the attribution been corrected? That's what we're trying to do. Then correct it. Family doesn't keep score. The sentence should have made me small. Instead, I looked at the Harrogate folder on my monitor. Dates. Versins. Names. Then stop submitting one that leaves me out. Mum inhaled. I ended the call before she could turn that sentence into a debate about tone. That evening, Daniel found me sitting at the kitchen table with my phone face down. How bad? Loud. He nodded. Do you want to talk? Not yet. Okay. No questions about whether I had made things worse. No reminder that his parents knew people in hospitality. No suggestion that somebody more powerful could make this disappear. He put a plate beside me. I ate without checking my phone. 2 days later, Dad showed up at the apartment with a folder. He had texted first. That alone told me something had changed. Can I come by? I have revised wording. I said yes. He sat across from me at the same table, where I had built the chronology. This time he did bring paper. The contributors section was better. Much better. Chloe Price, Interior Concept and Client Lead. Eleanor Price, Conservation Design Contributor. My eyes stopped there. For 1 weak second, relief almost made the decision for me. Then I kept reading. The narrative still described Price Studio as having developed an integrated conservation approach under Chloe Price's creative direction. Technically, a clever person could defend that sentence. That was the problem. It blurred enough to let the same story survive. Dad watched me turn the page. What do you think? It's closer. His shoulders shifted. Good. I didn't say accurate. The movement stopped. Ellie, the contributor line is better. The narrative still makes Chloe sound like she directed the conservation work. She directed the project. The client side of it. You know what it means. I know exactly why the wording is convenient. Dad rubbed his thumb over the edge of the folder. We have until tomorrow afternoon. I looked up. If you sit with us tonight, we can fix it. There it was. Not manipulation disguised as praise this time. Something more dangerous. A reasonable request. 2 hours. Maybe 3. I could open the files. I could rewrite the wording. I could separate the disciplines cleanly. The project itself was good. Chloe had done good work on it. Price Studio had done good work on it. Harrogate deserved attention. And I could probably save the entry before dinner. Dad must have seen something shift in my face. One last time, he said. My chest tightened. One last time. One last drawing. One last deadline. One last weekend. One last thing before I got back to my own life. That sentence, I said, is how 7 years became normal. Dad stared at me. I'm not asking you to do this forever. You never did. He leaned back. What does that mean? You never asked for forever. You asked for 5 minutes, then another 5, then a Saturday, then a consultant response. Every favor was temporary. The access wasn't. His jaw hardened. We're finally putting your name on it. Because I stopped giving you the work without conditions. That isn't fair. No, it's accurate. He looked down at the revised form. So you'd rather let the submission die? The question landed exactly where he intended. On the part of me that hated waste. That hated seeing good work compromised. That had spent years fixing things because leaving a preventable problem unresolved felt irresponsible. I folded my hands under the table so he wouldn't see them tighten. You can appoint a conservation consultant. There isn't time. That's a deadline problem. You could solve it. Yes. Dad looked almost relieved. Then I finished. I'm choosing not to. His expression changed. The words hurt me too. That mattered. It would have been easier if I couldn't help. Easier if the solution were outside my competence. Easier if refusing cost nothing. But I could save the entry, which meant choosing not to rescue. It was finally a choice rather than an excuse. Dad closed the folder. Your mother was right. You've changed. Maybe once I would have asked whether that was meant as an insult. I didn't. Yes. He left with the papers. The next morning, I went to the civic restoration site before work. Rain had darkened the stone along the lower wall. A junior architect was already there with the revised survey prints. For 40 minutes, we talked about moisture, old mortar, and an intervention someone had proposed decades earlier that had solved one problem by creating another. Normal problems, problems that did not love me, resent me, need reassurance from me, or know what I had been like at 17. My calendar held 2 protected weekends for that project now. Neither belonged to Bath. Standing there in a hard hat with damp air cutting through my coat, I realized that refusing Price Studio had not created emptiness. It had created room. The award administrator emailed later that afternoon. The clarification had not been completed within the required time. Harrogate House would not proceed in the current finalist presentation. There was no accusation in the message. No permanent exclusion. Only an administrative fact. I forwarded nothing. The next evening, Chloe texted, "We're still going tomorrow. I know half the room." I looked at the message for a long time. Then I put the phone down. The finalist presentation was held in Bristol, in a converted industrial building, with polished concrete floors and exposed brick that had been cleaned just enough to remind everyone what it used to be. Aisha and I had already bought industry tickets weeks earlier. Daniel came because I asked him to. That distinction mattered to me. Not because I needed protection, because I wanted my husband beside me at an event connected to my profession, without his presence becoming the source of my authority. Price Studio arrived 20 minutes after us. I saw Chloe before she saw me. She moved through the room with the confidence she had always possessed around strangers. She greeted people by name, touched elbows, smiled, stopped beside two people I recognized from regional design events. For a moment, watching her hurt in an unexpected way, she really was good at this. She knew how to enter a room. She knew how to make a client feel remembered. She knew how to turn enthusiasm into momentum. None of that had ever needed to belong to me, which made what she had taken harder to excuse. The program began. Project after project appeared on the screen. A converted mill, a church hall, a terrace restoration. I knew roughly where Harrogate had originally sat in the running order from an earlier schedule. The project before it finished. The presenter thanked the team. The screen changed. Another project appeared. Not Harrogate. No announcement. No explanation. No line saying why it was missing. Just absence. The room did not gasp. Most people probably did not notice. I did. So did Chloe. Her head turned toward the projection screen, then toward one of the event staff. She stood before the next introduction had finished. Mum caught her arm briefly. Chloe shook her off and walked toward the side of the room. I stayed seated. That was harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to watch. Another part wanted to leave before anyone could look at me and know. Aisha leaned closer. "You okay?" "Yes." "Want to go?" I looked at the screen. A small rural library project had just come up. "No. In a minute." So we stayed. I listened to the architect describe how they had preserved an old reading room. I wrote down the name of a supplier I wanted to research later. By the time the presentation ended, Harrogate was no longer the only thing in the room that mattered to me. That felt like its own kind of victory. Mum found me in the lobby. "There's still time to tell them this was a misunderstanding." "It isn't. They would listen to you." I already told them the truth. Her eyes moved briefly toward Daniel, then back to me. "You're really going to let this stand?" "Yes." Chloe appeared behind her. "You couldn't let me have one thing." I turned toward her. Her cheeks were flushed. I could not tell whether it was anger, embarrassment, or the heat of the crowded lobby. "It wasn't yours to give yourself." Her mouth opened. I didn't wait for the answer. Not because I was afraid of it, because I had already said the only thing that mattered. Daniel and Aisha were still near the coat check. I walked back toward them at my own pace. We didn't leave immediately. Aisha introduced me to someone working on a courthouse restoration. We spent 10 minutes talking about procurement and stone repair. Nobody knew or cared that my sister was furious 20 feet away. For years, I had thought conflict with my parents could fill every room I entered. That night, it didn't. The consequences arrived gradually over the next few weeks. Not dramatically. Professionally. Aisha forwarded me a copy of a consultant request she had received on a later Price Studio project. The team sheet named the outside technical specialists individually. Dad emailed once to say they had withdrawn from a heritage bid because the fee could not support the outside conservation consultant they now needed. Price Studio's website still showed Chloe smiling beside clients. The residential interiors work remained. So did the hospitality projects that did not require the kind of conservation input I had been quietly supplying. No collapse. No public disgrace. Just edges. For the first time, the studio had to stop where Chloe's actual competence stopped unless they paid someone qualified to carry the work further. Dad's next email arrived on a Sunday evening. "You could have saved this without hurting yourself. I hope one day you understand what you chose." I wrote 6 paragraphs, deleted 5, then deleted the 6th. My final reply contained one sentence. I understand exactly what I chose. I sent it. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. For one irritated second, I assumed it was Mum. The screen showed the name of the seamstress I had contacted about my wedding dress. I answered. Hello, Eleanor? I've had a proper look at the damage. My eyes moved toward the garment bag hanging from the wardrobe door. All right. I can repair it 2 ways. I can make the repair very discreet. With the lace reset, most people would never know where it tore. I touched the edge of the plastic. Or, there's a reinforcement method that would leave a visible line if you knew where to look. Stronger, but not invisible. She paused. Do you want me to hide it? For most of my life, invisible had sounded like praise. I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. No, I said. The answer came before I had time to soften it. The seamstress paused on the other end of the phone. No to hiding it? I looked through the clear plastic garment bag at the place where Chloe had torn the train. Yes. All right. Make it strong. Another brief pause. I can do that. After we hung up, I stood in front of the wardrobe for a while, with one hand resting against the garment bag. 3 months earlier, I would have asked whether the repair would look obvious in photographs. Now that question seemed almost funny. Not because appearance no longer mattered, because I was finally learning the difference between wanting something beautiful and needing everyone to believe it had never been damaged. The next few months were much less dramatic than the award evening. That was exactly what made them useful. Price Studio did not collapse. Chloe did not disappear from the design world. Mum did not suddenly lose every friend she had ever made. Dad did not call to announce that the business was finished. Life continued. So did consequences. I saw the first change on Price Studio's website. Their residential projects still looked polished. Chloe still appeared in photographs beside clients. The captions still used the language she was good at: warm, confident, aspirational. But the heritage section had changed. One project listed an external conservation consultant by name. Another credited a structural engineer separately. A week later, Aisha forwarded me a team sheet from a job where she had been asked to price part of the work. Her message contained only one sentence. Look at the consultant list. Every specialist was named. I read it twice. Then I closed the email. There was no satisfaction in imagining Chloe humiliated. The satisfaction was quieter. The record had edges now. A few days later, Dad emailed me. We've stepped away from the Lansdowne Heritage bid. The fee doesn't support bringing in the specialists they need. I knew that project. Before all this, Chloe probably would have sent me the plans on a Friday night with a cheerful message promising it would take 5 minutes. Now, Price Studio had to choose between paying for the expertise or not offering it. That was how professional boundaries were supposed to work. Not punishment. Cost. Responsibility. Choice. The business still had plenty of work in interiors and hospitality fit-outs where Chloe's actual strengths mattered. For the first time, that was enough. Almost exactly 4 months after my wedding, Chloe tested the boundary herself. Her email arrived on a Tuesday evening. Can you just tell me if this wall detail looks wrong? 5 minutes. An attachment sat beneath the message. My hand moved toward it automatically. That reflex embarrassed me more than I expected. After everything that had happened, some part of me was still trained to open the file first and ask questions later. The cursor hovered over the attachment. 5 minutes. I could hear her voice saying it. I could see my old kitchen table, laptop open late at night, dinner going cold while I told myself helping was easier than refusing. The attachment remained unopened. Instead, I typed, "You need a conservation architect formally appointed to the project." Her answer came 2 minutes later. "You are one." I stared at the sentence. Then I wrote, "Yes, just not yours." Nothing came back that night. The next morning, there were no missed calls, no angry messages from Mum, no demand from Dad that I reconsider. That absence unsettled me at first. Then I realized something important. A boundary did not need an audience to exist. I had said no. The world had continued. At work, the civic restoration project was beginning to take more of my week. The building was an old municipal hall with a complicated history of additions, bad repairs, and well-intentioned interventions that had created new problems over time. I liked it immediately. Not because it was beautiful, because it was honest about having survived things. The partner overseeing the project asked me into his office one Thursday afternoon. He closed a folder and pushed it toward me. "We want you to lead the next phase." For a second, old habit made me check the calendar in my head for obligations that did not exist. Mom's emergencies, Chloe's deadlines, Dad's requests. There was space now. Not accidental space. Protected space. "I'd like that," I said. He nodded. "I thought you might." No revelation. No dramatic promotion ceremony. No wealthy client who had heard about my courage. Just work I had already earned and now finally had enough room to accept. That evening, I opened my calendar and blocked the next site weekend. Then I marked the following Sunday unavailable. Not because I had plans. Because I was allowed to have a day nobody could claim. That felt more luxurious than anything Daniel's parents owned. Mum waited until December to try another route. Her message arrived while I was leaving a site meeting. "Can we please have a normal Christmas this year? No business, no wedding, no accusations, a fresh start." I stopped beside my car. For years, fresh start had meant only one thing in our house. Nobody had to answer for yesterday as long as I agreed not to mention it tomorrow. The words still pulled at me. Christmas had always mattered. The smell of orange peel and cloves in Mum's kitchen. Dad burning the first batch of roast potatoes because he got distracted. Chloe stealing the crispiest ones from the tray, while Mum pretended not to notice. Memory had a way of keeping warm things beside painful ones without asking permission. I called Mum instead of texting. She answered quickly. "Hi, darling." "Hi." Her voice became cautious. "Did you get my message?" "Yes. I thought it might be good for everyone." "What does a fresh start mean?" A pause. "It means we stop dragging this out. Has Chloe taken responsibility for tearing my dress?" Mum exhaled. "Ellie. Has she? She knows the wedding got out of control." "That isn't what I asked. Why does everything have to be stated so formally with you now?" The question almost made me smile. Because now had apparently begun when I stopped allowing vague language to replace responsibility. "What about Harrogate?" I asked. "That's finished." "Has Chloe acknowledged what she did with my work?" "She lost the award opportunity. What more do you want?" An answer. Mum's voice sharpened. "You got what you wanted." "No. What would you call it?" "I wanted my work described accurately. That happened. And Chloe suffered for it. She experienced the consequence of an entry she couldn't substantiate as submitted." "Listen to yourself." "I am." There was a longer pause. Then Mum said, "Do you really want to spend Christmas away from us over wording?" The old guilt reached me exactly where it always had. Not enough to change my answer. Enough to hurt. "This isn't about wording." "Then what is it about?" "You keep renaming what happened until I sound unreasonable for objecting to it." "That's not fair." "Maybe not to you." I looked through the windshield at the gray December sky. "But I'm not coming this year." She didn't shout. That somehow made it worse. "Fine," she said. "If that's what you want." It wasn't what I wanted. That was another thing boundaries had taught me. Sometimes the right decision and the desired outcome were not the same thing. After the call ended, I sat in the car for several minutes. My eyes burned. For once, I didn't use the pain as evidence that I had made the wrong choice. Christmas with Daniel was quiet. His parents invited us, but we split the day between them in our apartment, rather than disappearing into someone else's large house for the whole holiday. At our place, Daniel overcooked vegetables. I made fun of him. We walked after dinner. Nobody asked where Chloe was. Nobody asked whether Mum had forgiven me. The world contained entire days that did not depend on whether my mother approved of me. I had known that intellectually for years. Living it was different. Dad contacted me in January. His email was shorter than usual. I went through the Harrogate folders again. "I didn't realize how many revisions were yours." I read it once, then again. The old version of me wanted to reward the effort immediately. Tell him it was all right. Say I knew he had been busy. Make the admission easier to carry. Instead, I waited until the next evening. Then I wrote, "You knew I was doing unpaid work. You chose not to know how much." He did not answer for 2 days. When he finally did, the message contained no defense. "Can I buy you coffee?" We met halfway between Bath and Bristol. Dad looked older than he had at the award event. Or maybe I had stopped seeing him only as Dad. He was a man in his 60s who had spent years choosing the easiest version of a difficult truth. That did not make him a monster. It also did not make him helpless. He asked about work before he asked about Mum. That was new. "The civic project," he said. "What are you actually responsible for on it?" The question almost caught me off guard. "Not. How's that building?" "Not. Can you look at something for us?" "Not. Is it similar to what Chloe's doing?" "What are you responsible for?" "My team is leading the conservation package through the next phase," I said. "I'm coordinating the architectural work with the other disciplines and dealing with the historic fabric strategy." Dad nodded. "So you're the lead?" "On that scope, yes." He did not say he was proud. I did not need him to. He asked another question. "A real one," I answered. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes about my work before Price Studio came up. "When it did," Dad said, "we've had to change how we bid some jobs." "I know. Aisha? Some. Your website too." He gave a tired smile. "Of course you checked. Occupational hazard." For a moment, it almost felt normal. Then Dad looked down at his coffee. "I still think there was a way this could have been handled without losing Harrogate." There it was. Not full accountability. Not transformation. A smaller change. I set my cup down. "You may always think that." He looked up. "I'm not going to argue you out of it." "Then what are we doing here?" I considered the question. "Seeing whether we can talk without you asking me to fix something." Dad's mouth tightened, then relaxed. "That's fair." It was not reconciliation. It was a beginning with conditions. That was enough for one cup of coffee. By spring, the Civic Restoration Project had become the center of my working life. One afternoon, a junior architect handed me a revised issue sheet. "I put everyone's names on the contribution record like you asked." I checked it. Architectural lead. Conservation. Structures. Services. Cost consultant. Each person where they belonged. Good. Does it really matter that much? The question was innocent. I thought of Harrogate. Then I thought of every time someone's work became invisible because accuracy felt inconvenient. "It matters when people remember projects differently later." She nodded and took the sheet back. I didn't tell her the rest. Not every lesson needed its origin story. The dress was ready a few weeks before our first anniversary. The seamstress hung it in front of me. From a distance, it looked nearly unchanged. Closer, I could see the repair. A narrow, reinforced line moved through the lace where the original tear had split it. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't hidden. My fingers followed the stitching lightly. "I could still soften that visually," she said. "If you've changed your mind." "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." She smiled. "Good. I like it this way." "So do I." The strange thing was, I meant it. Daniel and I did not recreate our wedding. There was no second reception. No dramatic vow renewal. No attempt to overwrite the day Chloe had damaged. For our anniversary, we invited a few people to dinner. Aisha came. 2 friends from work. Daniel's sister and her husband. People who had stayed close without demanding explanations I did not owe them. I had the dress altered slightly, so it felt less ceremonial, though the repaired section remained. When I came out of the bedroom, Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "What?" "Nothing. That face means something." He smiled. "You look like you." It might have been the best compliment he could have given me. Dinner ran late. Someone opened another bottle of wine. Aisha told a story about a contractor who had once insisted a measurement was basically accurate, and I laughed hard enough that my stomach hurt. My phone buzzed once on the table. "Dad. Happy anniversary. Hope you both have a good evening." No request followed. I left the message unread until after dessert. There was nothing from Mum. Nothing from Chloe. The absence still hurt. Healing had not turned me into someone who did not care. It had only stopped caring from becoming obedience. Near the end of the evening, Daniel took out his phone. "Photo?" For a second, I looked automatically toward the edge of the group. The place I had stood in pictures for years. Near enough to belong. Far enough that cropping me out would not disturb the composition. Then I caught myself. Yeah, I stepped into the middle. Aisha moved to one side of me. Daniel stood on the other. Nobody asked me to make room. The repaired line in the dress was visible if someone knew where to look. I knew. That was enough. The camera clicked. Later, after everyone had gone home, I stood in front of the mirror while Daniel cleared glasses in the kitchen. My hand settled over the repaired lace. For most of my life, I had mistaken invisibility for strength. I thought being easy to overlook meant I was generous. I thought never asking for credit proved I was secure. I thought love meant making myself useful enough that nobody would have a reason to leave me out. The dress told the truth more simply. It had been torn. It had been repaired. The repair belonged to its history now. So did mine. I used to think restoration meant making damage disappear. Now I knew better. Some things became stronger when you stopped pretending they had never been torn.